The history of slavery is one of the darkest chapters in human history. But while the world has come to terms with the brutality of slavery, there are hidden truths that have remained untold for generations. One of the most disturbing, yet largely unspoken aspects of this history involves the complex relationships between white women and enslaved black men. This topic has long been shrouded in silence, yet the secrets it holds are crucial to understanding the full scope of slavery and its enduring impacts. Imagine a time when black men were enslaved on plantations, their lives governed by a cruel system of exploitation. Yet behind closed doors, these men were subjected to a form of abuse that is rarely discussed: the sexual exploitation by the very women who were part of the slave-owning class. White women, often viewed as innocent and protected from the outside world, played an active role in this dark narrative. But why? What led them to participate in such heinous acts? In order to understand the complexity of these relationships, we must first look at the power dynamics of the time. Slavery wasn't just a system of forced labor. It was a system of dehumanization. Black men were seen as less than human by the white society that controlled them, their bodies viewed as tools for economic gain. But when it came to white women, their role in this system was often overlooked or minimized. White women, though not directly involved in the day-to-day operations of the plantation, were far from powerless. As the wives of plantation owners, they were complicit in the system of slavery that kept their husbands rich and their lives comfortable. But as we now know, many of these women were not passive in their roles. In fact, some actively participated in the exploitation of enslaved men in ways that were both violent and degrading. These women's actions were not only a reflection of their privilege, but also a reflection of the deep racial and sexual power dynamics that defined their world. But it wasn't just about physical power. There was also a psychological element at play. White women were often portrayed as the epitome of virtue, purity, and innocence. Their role was to uphold the moral fabric of society. However, the reality was that many of these women were far from innocent. They were raised in a society where racial hierarchy was not only accepted, but expected. The idea that white women were untouchable, beyond reproach, was deeply ingrained in society. But this facade often masked the darker reality of their interactions with enslaved black men. Many white women, isolated on vast plantations, sought attention, comfort, and power in ways that society at the time would deem as unacceptable. It's important to acknowledge that the sexual abuse of enslaved black men by white women was not a one-off occurrence. It was, in fact, a widespread phenomenon, even if it was largely ignored by the historical record. What made these relationships even more complicated was the intersection of race and gender. White women had access to social power and protection, but within the confines of marriage, many found themselves constrained by the rigid expectations of their roles. Plantation wives, often isolated from other white women due to the geographical location of their homes, were frequently in positions where they were vulnerable to temptation. The enslaved men they came into contact with were often seen as tools to satisfy their emotional or sexual desires. But the real tragedy of this arrangement is not just in the acts themselves, but in the way these relationships were silenced. The voices of the enslaved men were rarely heard, and the women who participated in these abuses often went unpunished, their actions hidden from public view. For these women, their acts were a form of power, an assertion of control in a system where their own agency was severely limited. Yet, for the enslaved men, this relationship was one of complete domination. The ramifications of these actions were profound. These women were not simply victims of their time. They were active participants in a system that commodified human lives. The power dynamics in these relationships were rooted in a deeply racist and sexist society that dehumanized black men while placing white women on a pedestal of virtue. This system didn't just affect those involved in these relationships, It rippled through generations, leaving scars that would take centuries to heal. One of the most haunting aspects of this history is how it has been largely ignored or glossed over in mainstream discussions of slavery. When we think of the horrors of the plantation, we often imagine the brutality of white slave owners, the physical punishment, the forced labor. But the experiences of enslaved black men, particularly in relation to white women, are often left out of the conversation. The sexual violence that many endured at the hands of white women is not just a forgotten story. It is a history that has been deliberately erased. The erasure of this dark chapter is not just an oversight, it's a deliberate choice. By silencing these voices, we can maintain the myth of white purity and virtue, protecting the image of the innocent plantation wife. But to truly understand the impact of slavery, we must confront these uncomfortable truths. We must acknowledge the role that white women played in the suffering of enslaved black men, and the ways in which their actions were part of the larger machinery of oppression. The silence surrounding the sexual exploitation of black male slaves by white women is a painful reminder of how power dynamics can shape history. As we begin to uncover these hidden truths, we must ask ourselves, why has this history been ignored for so long? And what does it say about the way we view race, gender, and power today? In examining this issue, it's crucial to understand the role of patriarchy in shaping these relationships. White women, while benefiting from the system of slavery, were still subjugated to the patriarchal norms of their society. They were not free to act outside the bounds of social expectations, yet within the confines of their roles, they still wielded significant power over black men. This paradox, where white women were both oppressed and oppressors, adds a layer of complexity to the narrative of slavery. While the plantation system was designed to exploit black people as a whole, it also provided an opportunity for white women to exert control over those who were deemed inferior. This power wasn't just physical, it was psychological and emotional. Enslaved black men were often forced into these situations, with little recourse for escaping the sexual advances of white women. For these men, there was no place to turn for help, and no one to believe their stories. The shame and trauma of being sexually exploited, especially within a system where their worth was measured by their labor and not their humanity, created long-lasting effects. These men were often left with deep psychological scars that would never be healed. Many never had the opportunity to share their pain, their suffering, or their stories, and even when they did, they were silenced by a society that viewed their lives as disposable. In modern discussions of the legacy of slavery, it's easy to overlook the sexual violence and exploitation that occurred between white women and enslaved black men. But we must recognize that this violence was not incidental. It was an integral part of the system of slavery. It was a way for the system to maintain control and dominance, using sexuality as a tool of power and coercion. As we continue to explore these difficult truths, we must also reckon with the legacy of silence that has allowed this history to remain hidden for so long. By confronting these dark secrets, we can begin to understand the full scope of the damage done during slavery and the ways in which those wounds continue to affect our society today. The impact of these histories goes beyond the individual stories of those involved. It shapes our collective memory and understanding of the past. As we continue to engage with the painful truths of slavery, we must remember that acknowledging these dark secrets is not just about uncovering a painful history. It's about recognizing the ongoing legacy of oppression that continues to affect black communities today.